Every now and then, you have an album whose cover steals the spotlight from the music it represents. Don't ask me how often it happens, but I'm willing to bet there's a considerable number of people who would only recognize the cover of Dark Side of the Moon. Meanwhile, just about all of those people would probably look at a Jandek cover and not even realize it goes with an album. But connoisseurs of this music are always eager to make sense of those pictures and even spot a few patterns. Take the Fourth Era and live albums, for instance. This period proved that the Corwood representative did not just hang around Houston and take a few road trips. He has a real passion for sightseeing in Europe, especially when he finds older buildings like churches. But then along comes The Place, whose cover emphasizes something new. 3 female mannequins dominate the shot, making this the first one to feature some kind of human besides Jandek, which would only happen 3 or 4 more times, depending on who you ask. If this approach is shocking right now, just imagine how everyone felt back in 2003. With the title like The Place, they would have imagined anywhere but that storefront, and that's why it's so brilliant. But once you get past the imagery, you'll find that The Place is pretty consistent with the 2 prior albums. By the way, I have a few words about this era. To me, these albums seem to get sidelined a bit, with fans preferring the classics and live material. The jury finds me guilty of this crime. After all, look at how long it took me to continue this series. About 10 years ago, I Threw You Away stood out in my mind, and then I gradually lost interest in studio albums as I progressed through the catalog. Fast forward to the inception of this series, which was all about reflecting on my fanhood. Now I must focus on expanding it, if the project is to continue. Finishing this review will be what Faith No More calls a small victory, and if you're hearing these words, you can thank me by subscribing. The Place generally follows in the footsteps of its predecessors. Nuances include less reverb on the vocals and a slightly amplified guitar sound. Otherwise, you have pretty much the same tuning, and most importantly, the varied playing style. Lots of fretting, string bends, weird chords, playing louder and softer, playing faster and slower, and suddenly a harmonica on The Stumble, the closing track. A more nerdy fact is that The Place is considered by at least one person to be a concept album. Maybe that's just because each song title starts with the, making the track list almost resemble the table of contents in an epic novel. Also worth noting is that this is one of the shortest Jandek albums. A Kingdom He Likes is just barely ahead of it. As I scroll through the lyrics, it seems to me that most of the effort went into the first half of the album, the picture probably being my favorite. It reminds me of Aristotle's concept of the unmoved mover, except we're hearing about it from the perspective of the mover. This narrator can't perceive his body movements as anything other than a response to his mind. He apparently woke up from a dreamlike state and was baffled at how he created the world in front of him, which brings us one of the 2 most memorable lines on the album.
Presto, here's reality.
Just past the 5-minute mark, Jandek starts commenting on the human condition, especially the way we all collaborate in the learning process. But to make that work, we must have kind and thankful attitudes throughout. After the strange line about an annoying, glancing, piercing eye, the song ends on a high note, where we learn the meaning behind the title. The picture might be a bit lengthy for a newer fan, but if you enjoyed the last 2 albums, I think you'll find this to be top 10 worthy for this era. Quite literally, the title track is a key component of this album. But seriously, this has to be the track I've heard the most. What's interesting is that half the lyrics focus on a key that went missing, yet we don't even find out what's locked away. The remaining lyrics offer a clue. These items can be changed, but they're locked up since Jandek likes them the way they were. Furthermore, ownership of the key means he's the only one who could ever alter these items. It's not much to work with, so I'll just assume he has some kind of journal in there, perhaps with some unused song lyrics. One thing to note is that Seth Tissue left out a lyric on his website just before the 4-minute mark, which goes, "From the world and animals," and then proceeding with the rest. It's not a crucial detail, but it's worth remembering since you can't find that part anywhere on the internet. The Highway starts out like a cool song about getting blackout drunk, even though Jandek doesn't mention it outright. He apparently wakes up in his car by the highway, realizing he went on a death ride. At 1:37 comes a part that cracks me up. While everyone else agrees that he said, "I'm shooting like a star," I swear to God, he said shitting.
And here I'm shooting like a star in the sky.
Which makes sense given how much he had to drink. Anyway, the second half of the song is reminiscent of Alice in Wonderland, since Jandek warns us about some kind of rabbit hole, or chasm as he likes to call it. But with the way he awkwardly rambles about it, it's the part of the album where I start to lose interest. Not that the last two songs are bad, they're just a little confusing. I preferred The Answer, which takes place in some mountainous region, which is the easiest thing to figure out. In a nutshell, someone drove the narrator away one night and either crossed the border or got pulled over by the cops, judging by the flashlight shining on them. For the remainder, the narrator is in a building where some people are waiting to see him, and I'm sure the specifics will vary depending on who's listening. Now that I understand this album better than ever, which might not be saying much, there is still the question of whether The Place is a concept album. Unless the representative reaches out to me, or maybe Cecil Doyle, my guess is that there's no more of a concept than on the 80s albums. Despite the simpler lyrics, White Box Requiem came quite a bit closer to this status with its various themes, while The Place is just a mishmash of Jandekian situations. I suppose if you press play after a high dose of ketamine, the concept will materialize. By itself, the album is at least stronger than the prior one. That one had one essential track, while this one has two. The Place's biggest flaw is that the track list is front-loaded, which is not the case with I Threw You Away. And that concludes Jandek's second album trio in a row. We'll call it The Dawn of the Modern, to separate it from the albums in the next episode. That's right, I'm about to kill 4 European jewels with one stone.